here, 2 repeats, and I'm wondering if we should wait for just a couple more minutes in case there's people trying to finish their supper and rush over to this this event. And if you'd like to wait just a couple more minutes, I think it might be helpful. Please. Awesome. Well, thank you very much then. Thanks for the heads up there. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the second online town hall meeting on the topic of the preliminary ward boundary options, part of a larger ward boundary review. Tonight we've blocked off an hour and a half for you, and the agendas that we're doing right now. I'm giving you the overview. In a few minutes I'll hand it off to Dylan to offer the official welcome. Then we'll move into some presentations on the study and on the findings and what got assessed and what those preliminary options are. And it's a fairly lengthy presentation because there are 13 options to absorb, as you might know from the website if you visited the website. Throughout that process, we'll be gathering questions from the chat on this WebEx and on Facebook. So that, as the 4th step on that agenda indicates, we'll be answering questions. What we'll do is we'll answer all the questions that we collect, that we harvest throughout the presentation, and then we'll probably have time to just simply invite people to put up their hands and to verbally ask some of these questions as well. That can only happen inside of the WebEx meeting, though. It's kind of hard to verbalize it on Facebook. Okay, next slide. So just some guidelines here. These are some assumptions that we make at the outset, that everyone has wisdom and that we need everyone's wisdom for the wisest results. It couldn't be more true than it is for this exercise, because that's what we're here for. We're really here to tap into people's wisdom and insight. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That just means that no one person has the answer, and that we have to really hear every little bit and piece to make sure that when we build on each other's ideas, we come up with the best ideas. And that there's no wrong answers. That means turn off that editor in your mind that says, oh, that's a dumb question. Because if you got a question and you think it's even a dumb question, ask it anyways, because it's almost guaranteed that somebody else had that question too. So for tonight, there's no need to win or lose, so there's no need to argue. We can just get our ideas out in the open, and we'll be collecting them all because it influences our thinking. Of course, any rude or disrespectful comments won't be shared and won't be included in any public documents that we have to produce, so we'll all be on our best behavior. Next slide. So the purpose of tonight is to make sure that people learn enough about this project, the ward boundary review, so that they feel able to provide deep insights and advice to the consulting team. So that's who's actually listening at this point. It's the consulting team. They're trying to pick people's brains and really understand so that we can move from preliminary options to preferred options over the next couple of months. And so that eventually when the team comes back to council and says, here's what we think was going to work for Guelph, then there'll be a lot of confidence in the quality of that result. So we're providing the input so you can have input to the larger decision. Okay, next slide. So the process is pretty simple. There'll be presentations. You ask tons of questions if you can. Put them all in this WebEx chat or in the Facebook chat. And we'll collect them up and answer them after the presentations. And any questions we can't answer, we will do the homework and get it to you. And we post everything online at this engagement website called haveyoursay.guelph.ca/council-composition. Next slide. So just to make sure, like we're here to make sure that we capture your questions, okay? So here's the locations. This is also being live streamed on guelph.ca/live, but you can't interact with it there. You can watch it, but there isn't a chat box or an audio component to it. So you'll have to watch and listen and add your questions and comments in a different way. I'll get into that in a second here. Continue, please. Next slide. So probably the most important message to get out there, and I'm going to keep repeating it, is the website called haveyoursay.guelph.ca/council-composition, because there you can see everything that we've got. Everything that we've got, we're putting it out there so that people can inform themselves. There's background papers, there's some videos of other presentations, and this one probably in a few days. There's maps where you can stick pins in the map. There's a mapping tool there that's kind of fun to play with because you get to overlay the different kinds of ward options. But the most important thing in terms of having your say and having your input is to do the survey that's on that website. So read everything you can, look at everything you can, then do the survey. The survey is quite straightforward and obvious. It's trying to figure out which options make the most sense and why. Okay, next slide. So there's lots of ways to get in touch. We're open. We've got this consultation period open until March 14th. We're kind of in the midpoint with this. And so you can send emails to clerks@guelph.ca. You can send a good old-fashioned quill and parchment letter to the clerk's office at City Hall. There were some dedicated phone times set aside, and there's phone numbers here, but there's phone numbers. All of this is on the website as well. Okay, so don't feel like you have to write all this down. Go to the website. Everything you need to know is there. Next slide. So I should point out that the consulting team is led by Watson and Associates. They're in association with IC Associates. That's the outfit that I work with. And then Dr. David Siegel and Dr. Robert Williams. So it's a whole team of people with diverse skill sets that are being brought to bear here. We were retained by the city back in January last year, pre-COVID, and then we hit the brakes and had to get it started again in the summertime with the council composition review and employment status review. And that went to council in November, and then council gave us further instructions, and that launched the second round, which is now the ward boundary review. Yeah, next slide, please. So let me introduce the project manager and lead, Eric Carvinen. He's listening in on this call. He's not involved in the presentation, but he will be here taking notes, listening, and answering questions as needed when we get to that part of the agenda. But Watson and Associates are economists for the most part. So they've done a huge amount of things like demographic analysis, growth forecasting, data modeling. Really, they are the data people, and they've worked with tons of different municipalities and school boards and some conservation areas or authorities. So they work largely in the public sector with doing all sorts of rather detailed forecasting and modeling and such. So that's why they're the lead on this project. The next person to introduce is Dr. Robert Williams. I tend to call him Bob. We've known each other for a little while. He's a public affairs consultant, former professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. I know it's not Guelph, it's down the road a bit, but he's been consulting with on municipal affairs since 2008. And he's collaborated with Watson and Associates on a lot of different projects, mostly ward boundary reviews and some council composition studies as well. Next slide. Now, David Siegel is Dr. David Siegel. Again, tend to familiarly call him Dave. Also a former political science professor at Brock University and founding director of the Niagara Community Observatory, interestingly. He's a prolific author and editor of books and journals on the topic of municipal governments and administration. So he's bringing that talent to the table as well. Next slide. And me, I'm a facilitator. I'm president of ICA Associates and been facilitating for over 25 years. And so I'm on board for the public engagement side of things. And we had to completely reinvent this process from something that was going to be in person, face to face in those halls where you get to touch all the maps and everything to something that is online. And we're doing it. Okay. I also have a background in political science. Now, I'd also like now to turn it over to Dylan McMahon. Dylan is the lead on the city side. So we experience him as our client, the main point of contact. It says here he's a proud University of Guelph grad in political science as well. He's been with the city for 9 years. He's the manager of legislative services. He's a deputy city clerk for the city of City of Guelph. Well, I live in Whitby, so I'm sorry about that, Flub.
Thanks, John. Definitely Guelph, to be clear.
Guelph,
the city of Guelph,
city
not
of
the city
Guelph.
of Oshawa. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and Dylan is going to kick us off formally this evening, and I'm going to mute myself until it's my turn later on.
Thanks for the introduction, John. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to keep reminding people, whenever you get a question, type it into the chat, and so that don't hang on to it until later. Write it in the chat box, and we'll grab it and we'll remember it for later. Okay? Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, John. I think I'll really just add on to what you say, which is we want to make sure that we use these times to get as much feedback from the residents of Guelph as possible. So this project, we know more than others probably, really strikes right to the sort of core of what is our local government in Guelph. The outcome of this work is really going to be how do we provide Guelph residents, or how do we ensure Guelph residents have access to effective representation at the local level, at their council. And we know we're not going to be able to do that if we don't harvest all of the expertise and knowledge and sort of Guelphiness that lives out in our community. So I want to thank everybody who's watching either on guelph.ca or joined us in the WebEx meeting today, but also people who've gone online, filled out surveys, looked through 13 plus maps, dropped pins here and there to tell us what's good or bad. We know that that's what's going to make this project successful. So thank you so much for participating, and I won't hold us up any longer, but before we begin, I will read Guelph's territorial acknowledgement. As we gather, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a city, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. Today, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe people on whose traditional territory we are meeting. Finally, before we move into the bulk of the presentation tonight, I do want to bring greetings from Mayor Guthrie and City Council. It was City Council who had the foresight to direct staff to do this work, and obviously they're going to have a very difficult decision on their hands in June when the results of this work come forward. But hopefully through events like this, we're able to make their job a little bit easier by making sure that we've got as much knowledge and insight from the community as we possibly can. So to that end, I will pass things over to Bob Williams.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm happy to pick up the thread from here. This is a project that has two phases, and the first phase was primarily concentrated on what we call council composition and employment status. And that has a certain set of questions, and the next slide will show us the things that we were asked to consider during that first phase. They are listed there, first of all, and not in any perhaps particular order, but part of our discussion was how many councillors are appropriate for a city, for the city of Guelph, given the size of the city and its growth. That is not a given. That is something that council can decide. Then we were going to consider whether the councillors should be elected in wards, which is the way that is operated in Guelph since roughly 1990, or whether they should be elected across the whole city. And so that's a secondary choice about the kind of election system that will operate. The third point was how many councillors should be elected in each ward. If there are to be wards, should it continue with a system of 2 councillors per ward. So that's the, if you will, the status quo, but that also could be open to change. Then finally, we were asked to begin to consider, and we can't answer that completely yet, but wondering whether the city of Guelph would benefit from having city councillors who could devote themselves full time to their council responsibilities, or whether they should remain part-time. And each of these questions we will return to later in this presentation. So our first phase report raised those questions, made some recommendations to council. So the next slide summarizes the direction that council gave us. We had participated in a meeting in early November where council discussed that report and came out of that with certain directions that we were to follow in phase 2, that is the current part of the big review. The first direction was Guelph city councilors should continue to be elected in a ward system. So the wards will not be dissolved. There will still be wards that we will use for the next election. And we were also directed to conduct additional rounds of community engagement. And this is the second part of phase 2, just not to get too confused about where that is, but this is the second part of this phase. But the engagement directed us to consider scenarios that include 8, 10, or 12 councillors. So referring back to that question of how many councillors there should be, we're also to consider the number of councillors elected per ward. So again, 2 members per ward, 1 member per ward, or some other method. And then also the question of the employment status of councillors. These questions, certainly the first 2 are interrelated, and as we'll see later, the answer to certain ones of those will have a bearing on what the other one is. So with that direction, then we begin to think about the ward boundary review. Yes, there will be wards. The first question, though, or one of the key questions, is how many? And so our question will come back to that in a few moments. But let's just talk quickly about what a ward boundary review is. This is a process that is concentrated on the electoral units that would be in place in Guelph to elect members of council. So the objective has at least 3 parts here that we're talking about. First of all, we start with the existing wards. And as we'll suggest in a few moments, there are certain guiding principles that we are asked and would normally apply in the development of wards. So we start with the current wards. Do they still work? Are there some strengths? Are there some things that need to be adjusted? We need, if we're going to look at alternatives, to work out where we start from to help us determine where we ought to go. Secondly, we will develop alternative designs that are consistent with the principles that I just referred to. And those principles reflect the present distribution of the population and the neighborhoods. It's not just about numbers, but it's about capturing the qualities of the Guelph community as those would be reflected in a ward system. So those are considerations that went through, that go through where we are now and will lead us through to the very end. Ward boundary reviews, of course, are not mandatory in Ontario. These are processes that are largely initiated through local initiative. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that the boundaries in Guelph have remained largely unchanged since 1991, 30 years ago. There were a couple of small changes, but by and large, the system that is in place was designed for the Guelph of 1991, not the Guelph of 2021. So in that first phase, we also did some consultation. At the beginning of this phase, rather, and we've summarized these in the preliminary options report that is available on the city website that offered the chance for the community to give us some direction about how we would approach some of these questions. So the key features of that consultation process, again, because of the climate we're in, involved online engagement, which was available for 24 hours a day for 2.5 weeks. That included a survey, and we had 220 people who answered that survey. This provides us, again, with some insights, not just yes or no, but reasons why they responded to the questions they did. We have also developed extensive background documents and other contact information that allows members of the community to ask questions and to get answers. So what we're doing tonight is only part of the resources that are there, and many of those things will be helpful for individuals who wish to respond to the survey to make sure that they are fully briefed on what we're looking at and how we're going about it. So we also have then a live stream virtual town hall structured like a panel discussion designed to provide background information on the ward boundary review. That is still available on the city's website, and I encourage people to go have a look at that as their time permits. So we're going to move over to guiding principles, and I'm going to ask David Siegel to jump in at this point.
Thanks, Robert. The next thing we do need to talk about is guiding principles as we move from a discussion of the current system to some of the options that we're going to be looking at later on. There's one overriding principle that absolutely drives everything that we have to think about, and that overriding principle is the idea of effective representation. This was defined by the Supreme Court in a decision commonly called Carter v. Saskatchewan. And the Supreme Court said that any government involved in any sort of electoral boundary drawing had to take into account this idea of effective representation. Now, this is not defined in provincial legislation. However, over time, in terms of the Ontario Municipal Board, as it used to be called, and the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal, which its current name, certain subsidiary principles have been developed around this idea of effective representation. And so we think about 4 of these when we start drawing ward boundaries. First one is representation by population. That the principle of one person, one vote says that the wards need to have a reasonably equitable population. Now, you'll understand why I said that reasonably equitable when we look at some of these other principles. The second principle is projected growth patterns. Guelph is slated for a significant amount of growth, and that growth is probably going to occur in certain areas of the city. We want to draw ward boundaries that work not just for the next election in 2022, but work for the next 2 elections after that. So we're going to be drawing boundaries that have reasonable population parity with the existing population numbers, but we also have to have an eye to what those numbers are going to look like 10 years from now, because Guelph doesn't really want to go through this business of redrawing ward boundaries every 4 years. So we try to make ward boundaries that work for the upcoming election in 2022 and the next 2 elections after that. The third guiding principle is communities of interest. Within any municipality, there are certain kinds of neighborhoods, I guess. Communities of interest can be a little bit tricky to define, but this clearly has something to do with neighborhoods, as would be defined by people of a similar socioeconomic status, an attachment to a particular park or a particular community center or a neighborhood association. This is what we mean by communities of interest. And we need to be careful that we don't draw ward boundaries that separate particular communities of interest. Sometimes that can run counter to our first criterion of representation by population. So you just have to balance these things. And the fourth thing we think about is natural boundaries and geographic features. And what we mean by these are things like water courses, major highways, major railways, ravines, things of this nature that provide a kind of natural separation of the city so that people have an easy understanding that, oh yeah, if I live south of that major highway, then I'm in such and such a ward, and people who live north are in a different ward. Just makes the ward boundaries understandable when you draw them based on these natural boundaries that people deal with every day anyway. So now on the next slide, what we're going to be talking about is the idea that, you know, a ward system is not going to be able to meet all four of these criteria. Some of them conflict with one another. You know, it would be very easy to draw ward boundaries that have absolute perfect equality of population. But in order to do that, you would have to draw some dividing lines through communities of interest, which would not be desirable. So we have to figure out sometimes how to balance these things and which priorities to emphasize. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the result of the public engagement exercise, where we ask people, which one of these criteria, how do you rank these four criteria in terms of the priority that you assign to it? And what you see there is the bar that's identified as population parity was the first priority for 38% of the population. So that was something that weighed in very heavily. Second after that was communities of interest. Natural boundaries were fourth, and you can also see what the second, third, and fourth priorities are there. So that's how you people felt. That's how people who responded to our survey felt. Now, on the next slide, we look at the idea that population parity is the most important principle to people. So we'll take that into account. But we cannot ignore these other priorities, such as communities of interest. And we try to minimize the imbalances, but it's a matter of doing a balancing act around these things. So those are the principles. The next thing we want to talk about is Guelph's existing structure. And so on the next slide, we have the existing ward system. And as Robert said, this has been in existence since 1991. So people who follow the electoral system will be familiar with this. There have been some changes, and there's an interesting table. This table is quite interesting because it shows the extent to which a particular ward deviates from the ideal population. So a ward would have the ideal population if it was 1. And you'll see there some wards are considerably more than 1 and some are less than 1. What we did on the next slide is we looked at the 4 principles and we said, so in terms of the first principle, the representation by population, how well does the current Guelph ward boundary structure deal with representation by population? And our answer to that was not very well. What about projected growth patterns? Again, if you go back to that table from the previous slide, you'll see that it doesn't deal very well with projected growth patterns as well. Third thing we looked at was communities of interest. And what people told us on that is that the current system works pretty well with regard to communities of interest. With regard to natural boundaries, people were not so keen on the idea that that natural boundaries formed a part of the ward system. So our overriding principle, which we have here at the bottom, which is kind of, we want to look at it as the accumulation of the 4 guiding principles, the overriding principle of effective representation, we had to come up with the idea that the existing Guelph system is partially successful. And this is a good reason why we need to look at the existing boundaries, and we need to consider what sort of changes will be made. Now, the next slide talks about the survey responses. And some people took the opportunity in the surveys to comment on the qualities of their existing counselors. That's not what this exercise is about. This exercise is about drawing the ward boundaries. And 35% of respondents said they did not feel that the current ward boundaries provided them with effective representation. That's over a third of the population. So that is a significant portion of people who had some problems, had some qualms about the existing boundary structure. And a lot of people commented on the difference in the population of the wards, and they were particularly thinking about what's going to happen with the growth that's anticipated in the south, for example. So that is the principles that we use to think about these ward boundaries. I'm going to pass this thing back to Robert now so that he can talk about how we started working out some preliminary options in terms of the ward boundaries, the options that we're going to consider.
If I may just interject for a split second, I want to remind anybody who's listening, if any kind of question pops into your mind or a comment pops into your mind, write it down immediately so you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. We're cutting them and pasting them into an intermediate document so that we can answer everybody's questions at the end. I'm complete.
Thank you, John. Let's talk then about preliminary options. There are a couple of things that we need to just keep in mind here. This exercise in some ways is not straightforward. Council gave us legitimate directions that will help them make a decision. And that, as we suggested in an earlier slide, we were directed to develop scenarios that included 8 counselors, 10 counselors, or 12 counselors. But there was also the question of how many counselors per ward. Well, when you put those two parts together, it results in what we're calling models for representation, and that means 6 of them. That could be a situation where there are 4 wards, electing 3 each, if it's 12, 5 wards if it's 10-member council, 6 wards if it's the current size and 2 members, 8 wards to elect 1 councillor each, 10 wards electing 1 councillor each, or as many as 12 wards electing 1 councillor each. So what follows then is a fairly complex set of choices, if I can put it that way. And we've tried to develop at least 2 options for each of those models. So the models, the term model is referring to the 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, and 12. The options are the versions within each of those. So there are a total of 13 options that we're bringing to this part of the review. And this is, again, why we want some public feedback. The next chart, or the next slide rather, shows that in chart form. Again, as we've suggested, all of this material is on the website. You don't have to write it all down now. You don't even have to necessarily follow each of these parts as we go through them, but we're going to walk you through the 6 models and the various options within those to help us decide what we're going to be recommending to council. And as you'll see in the survey, one of the key parts of that is to tell us, on the one hand, which of these you think has no value for Guelph, but on the other hand, which ones do. So as we move into this next part of this discussion, there are some very general thoughts that I'd like to just ask you to be thinking about as you look tonight and later on at the various options that are out here. And these are, if you will, fairly high level considerations. Certainly at some point, you'll want to go in and look at where those lines are, where your neighborhood lies in the various scenarios. And we do have many ways for you to do that. But we also want to think about, if you will, the big picture, the 30,000-foot picture of Guelph that comes out of these particular models. So one of those, of course, is to look carefully at how population parity is achieved or not achieved in the various options. How well have we been able to do that? And related to that, how well the various options can deal with the projected population growth. We have reasonably reliable basis for that. So those calculations figure into some of these scenarios, but have a careful look at, does it meet it now? And is that a priority, or does it meet it later, again, as a priority? Second part of that list is to look at the individual communities themselves. Are they captured correctly? Are they represented in the wards in a way that you understand them? You live there, you work there, you travel through there. Do you see that community as effectively gathered within a ward? And there are a few things that may not be that obvious, especially if you don't live there, but for others, just to think about it. How, for example, is the downtown handled in these systems? Is it in a single ward? Should it be in a single ward? But is it in a single ward, or is it divided up? And is it divided up in a plausible way? And what about the junction? Is it captured properly? Is it associated with other neighborhoods that make sense? And then to look at the other kinds of groupings of communities and neighborhoods. This is a fairly important part of what we want to try to do, because we heard that in the survey. People see Guelph as an extension of their own community, and that needs to be properly captured in the wards that are here. The other points here are, again, bigger issue questions. Look at the number of wards themselves, and again, that's obvious. Is it 4? Anywhere up to 4 to 12. Does that number seem to work to you? And also look at how they're distributed. How many of them are in the north versus the south? Is that a reasonable way to think about the city? And if so, how many in the north, how many in the south? And then the other 2 points, which model fits well with the number of counselors per ward? There are a couple of them in here that could go either way. It could be a multiple member ward, or it could be a single member ward. But if you have a thought about having continuing with 2-member wards, which of these scenarios are most attractive? If you're inclined towards saying you'd like to see single member wards, then other versions might be more appealing. And then lastly, what are the natural boundaries within Guelph, and how are they used in this structure? And in our preliminary evaluation, we discovered that there are fairly significant natural boundaries that really aren't used in the wards. And we've tried to make sure that those visible boundaries play a role as ward boundaries as well, because as David suggested earlier, usually there is, if you will, not a lot of interaction between neighborhoods on either side, let's say, of a river or of a major rail line. So we've tried to make sure that those are used, but you may not agree with the way that's laid out. So those are the big picture questions that I'm asking you to be thinking about as we work through 13 options. And I'm going to ask Dave to start on the first of those.
You're muted,
Sorry,
Dave.
Dave, still muted. There we are.
Sir. I have the unenviable task of starting the task of talking about 13 different options. In the interest of time, we'll have to go through them fairly quickly, but there is a report that's available on the website that's been mentioned that you can have a look in more detail at these. You can have at your leisure, you can look at these individual maps and think about those very important points that Robert was talking about, and evaluate each one of these 13 options we're going to present in terms of what Robert was talking about, how does this affect your neighborhood? So let's start with 4 wards, possibility of 4 wards. Now, if Guelph would opt for 4 wards, first of all, that's a significant change from the existing 6. But you'd have a couple of options with regard to 4 wards. You could have 2-member wards, in which case you'd have 8 counselors, or you could have 3-member wards, in which case you'd have 12 counselors. So those are the sort of general options with regard to 4 wards. The first option that I'll present the map is what we've called option 4A. And this divides the city, as you see it, 2 wards in the north, 1 ward sort of in the central part of the city, and a large ward in the southern end. This is fairly favorable in terms of the population parity, both now and in future years. By the way, I mentioned that report that's available on the website. That report has population figures for each one of these options, similar to the one that Robert showed us for the existing boundary. So it'll show you that you can look at your leisure, the different population figures in these boundaries, both for 2021 and for the projection for 2031. The next option that we'll look at is option 4B. And option 4B is really neat and easy to understand. The east-west boundary is Gordon Street and Woolwich. North-south boundary is the rivers through most of it. So it's very simple, very easy to understand, which is a real consideration in terms of, people should be able to readily remember and understand which ward they're in. However, this particular one is a bit weaker than 4A in terms of the population parity. So those are the 2 options that we had for the 4 ward model. The next series of models that we looked at was the 5 ward model. Now this gets us a little bit closer to what Guelph has currently, and it also provides an option with 5 wards. You could have one member per ward and 5 counselors. That would most likely be full-time counselors, which raises another issue that we need to address at some point. Or you could have 2-member wards and have 10 counselors. So the wards there, ward option 5A, has some similarities to the existing 6 ward configuration. The downtown is contained within 1 ward. It's combined with the east end. There was some interest in having what was called a downtown ward, but of course the downtown is not large enough to be its own ward. It has to be combined with something else. But this one does put the entire downtown in the same ward, which some people liked and other people didn't. So this is the kind of option that you can think about. Now, this had good population parity in both currently and in the future and in 2031. The next option is labeled 5B. And this option is oriented in a different way. It kind of cuts the wards in a radically different way from 5B. And it also has pretty good population parity. And it uses the river as a natural boundary, which is one of the considerations that we wanted. The next model that we'll look at the 6 ward model, which is what Guelph has right now. So it's the one that is closest to the status quo and quite possibly the more comfortable one for people to have a look at. Now, option 6A is really fairly similar to the existing boundaries. It's what we call modified, the modified status quo. It provides an improvement in population parity, and it also uses the natural physical boundaries of the city as much as we can. So this we see as an improvement on a couple of grounds, the better population parity and the idea of the natural boundaries. And it's also, you know, if you like the status quo, this is quite close to the status quo, but it improves the status quo in terms of population parity. The next option that we'll look at is option 6B. And this draws the wards in quite a different way in that it has 2 south and 4 mostly north of the rivers. And it provides good population parity in 2021 and also in 2031. However, Ward 6, the southern area, is a bit problematic. And of course, that's an area that we're anticipating quite a bit of growth in, but we don't know exactly when that growth might be occurring. So that's 6B. And the next option then is 6C, which is quite a radically different option from some of the ones that we've looked at so far. It splits the downtown, which, as I said, some people thought was a good idea, other people did not like. But this option provides really quite good population parity. So if you like population parity, then this might be the option that you would like. So those are the 4, 5, and 6 ward options. I'm going to pass this back to Robert to begin talking about the 8 ward options.
And I'm going to let John have another plug in there while we make the transition.
Yeah. So remember, folks, thank you. It just takes a while to load up here. So remember, if you've got any questions as we're going through, I know we're going through kind of fast, so you just write it down in the chat in WebEx or Facebook, and we're just harvesting straight from there. If there's any questions of clarification, we can come back to it later. If you have more substantial questions, we can come back. We'll definitely deal with those as well. Okay, so just park it in the chat right away, please.
Right. Thank you, John. So we're now moving on to the 8 ward models, 2 versions of that. Let me just mention too, though, these are preliminary. So we're looking for feedback and ideas about the specific models and about which of these general approaches are to be retained. So an 8 ward option really is about single member wards. There's no appetite to increase the size of Guelph Council to say 16. So this is a model, an option that is geared toward single member wards. So it allows for that reduction. Of course, with 8 wards, each one is going to be a little smaller than the 6 wards. And it could be go hand in hand with the idea of full-time counselors. So 8A is the first one of these. This includes 5 wards, about 5. There's a split across the proposed Ward 1 between the north and south, but about 5 wards north and 3 to the south. That's a somewhat different proportion than the other models, but part of the goal here, or part of the capacity rather, here is to make finer cuts, if I can put it that way, to pull smaller areas together and consider them wards. So one of the things to notice in this one is that the proposed Ward 3 is essentially the downtown area, with a little bit of spillover to the east. So this is a different approach to that downtown. And as David suggested a moment ago, some people think that would be a great idea. Others are not so sure. So what do you think about that? This model, though, has reasonably good population parity in 2021. And don't forget, we're catching up from 1990. We can get to a reasonable balance by 2031 that is less successful. 8B is adopted from 4B. That was the quadrant, if we called it, where we split the city basically between Gordon Street and the river. This essentially subdivides each of those quadrants into 2 wards. Because there was a population issue in that previous one, in that 4B, some of that is still reflected in this scenario, but over time the population evens out. And again, remember the numbers are on in the documents that are on the website, so you can go have a look at that yourself. So the 10 ward option then is taking us again into new territory. This has got 2 components. One is that, of course, it involves a reduction in the size of council, a modest reduction from 12 to 10. So it's both a reduction and it's clearly a 1 member per ward system. And as we've seen in these, and as we will here, each of these scenarios involves smaller and smaller wards, and the councillors themselves are dealing with fewer residents. The question of workload gets factored into there, and we will talk about that in the report about what the trade-off might be. But 10 ward options, as we see when we immediately look at them, that each of the wards become smaller. It is possible to create a ward that is drawn from very similar neighborhoods without having to pull together pieces of areas that are a little less remote. So when we look at this, the one downside that jumps out at me, of course, is that the proposed wards 3 and 9 cross over the Hanlon Parkway. That's sorry, and 5 as well. That may not be a desirable arrangement, but that's how we have to make the cut to get into something approximating parity. And in 2021, this has a reasonable balance that, in fact, as growth goes on, because again, the heavy growth areas are in wards that are primarily built around those areas, that balance can be maintained out to 2031. In 10B, we're looking at 5 wards to the north and part of a ward, again, this ward on the east side crossing over, and 4 to the south. It turns out that in 2021, this is not a great balance, again, because of the areas of low growth that are captured, or sorry, of low population that are captured in wards, and the growth is not as consistent across those. And you can see that some of these become a little bit more difficult to appreciate as collections of communities to fit into the 10. But there may be merit in here that you as a resident see by grouping yourself in a certain way that you may not see in the 10 ward. It uses the Hanlon as boundary, though. Again, at the northern side, it uses the Speed and Aramasa rivers. So that is a benefit of that system. The 12 ward model, to finish that, and I hope we're not rushing things too much here, but the 12 ward model is obviously about maintaining the present size of council, but converting it to a 1 member per ward system. Again, as we move along, the wards become smaller. By that measure, they become somewhat easier for a councillor to cover that area, to become familiar with it, and to address issues within that particular geographic area. So the 2 12 ward options here are presented in the next 2 slides. 12A is in many ways adapted from the existing 6 ward option, not exactly slicing up each of them into 2, but a certain amount of resemblance to that. And this one actually provides a very generally acceptable population parity in 2021, But again, because growth is concentrated, I'm thinking primarily the southern part of the city and potentially on the eastern side, that balance is less, is not maintained throughout that period. And then 12B is again adapted from the existing system, but places 7 of the words, most of 7 words, 6 and a bit to the north and the remainder to the south. Some similarities between the two 12s, but a little bit of a difference along the way. So this is, again, a generally accepted population parity. The exception is the Ward 8, which is not large enough, frankly. It simply becomes much too small because of the way the other parts have been cut off. So those are the options, the models and the options. Before I turn things back to John to talk about the next steps, I think one of the things I'm going to scoop him on a little bit is that one of the things we ask you in the survey is, which of these things you think we shouldn't even consider? I mean, again, we're going back to the direction from council. Come up with a model for X number of councillors. Some of them may simply not be suitable for Guelph. We're not trying to pretend they are. We think if there is an appetite for them, these are a very good starting point, but there may be a feeling in the community that some of these changes are much more drastic than we want. So again, we'd like to hear about that in your responses. John.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dave. Where do things go from here? If we could have the next slide. So there's 3 rounds of public consultation happening in this phase, in the ward boundary review. We did the guiding principles consultation back in January. We're in the midst of the preliminary options review right now, trying to get your feedback on that. And then when preferred options get developed in April, there will be another round of consultations just to make sure that that's what makes the most sense, so that we can report it to council, for council to make their own decision. They make their own decision here, and we're just trying to inform it as best we can. So there's we're in the middle of it all right now with the heavy lifting and all of these various options. Next. And so what can you do with all this? Basically, I want to reassure you that all of the options are technically viable. So the question becomes, which ones make the most sense for Guelph, right? Similarly, each option has its drawbacks and its benefits. There's no such thing as perfect. So which trade-offs make the most sense for Guelph? And the only way to wrap our heads around that is, and for you to wrap your head around it, is to go to the site, take the listen to these presentations, read the background papers, play with the maps, and talk to your neighbors and friends and family about these files as well. Persuade other people to get involved, because I find that, you know, when you talk about things with people, our minds change. Our ideas become sharper or clearer and sometimes softer too. So do talk with your neighbors about this. Next slide. And again, most importantly, go to the haveyoursay.guelph.ca/council-composition page. If you just got as far as the haveyoursay.guelph.ca, you'll see that council composition is one of the options there that you can click on. That's where a lot of the city consultations are these days. So go there, study the options. There's a really cool mapping tool that's been added that is actually a geographic information systems kind of tool. So it's a real map with real drawings on top of it, and you just simply click down the menu bar to turn on and off the different models so that you can look at them. And then you can also just turn them on, off, and you can do a little bit of overlay and comparison, almost like you're working with transparencies back in the old days, laying one layer on top of the other and seeing through it, right? It's important to read the preliminary options report because it gets into a lot of detail about each option, and you can see those charts with the population projections in them, because maybe the population numbers are influencing your decisions, you know, that this one is good enough and that one's not good enough. It's very informative. We try to give you whatever we can there. A lot of the questions and answers also, like coming out of today and from telephone calls and emails, a lot of the questions and answers go into a question and answer section of this same website. So if you got a question, maybe it's already been addressed there and you can find out how it's been answered and updated too. And so we're going to try and answer questions tonight, but if there's any question that we put out to the panelists that they go, gee, I don't know, I'm going to have to get back to you on that, then you have the option of letting us know how to get back in touch with you in this fairly public format. But the other option is go and register on this website and check out for updates on that Q&A section. Okay, next slide. The sharing your thoughts is like the most important next step. So after you've learned as much as you can, you take the survey, which really basically says, you know, which options would you remove consideration, which ones would you support for further consideration, and after you kind of weighed that up a little bit, then okay, which one preliminary option would you support the most, okay, and why? All right. And then there's the question that goes on right after that about, well, in that option that you support the most, would you foresee that the counselors would be working full-time or part-time in that scenario? Okay, so those are the questions you'd be faced with on that survey, and that's really the whole thing. That's a bit of paraphrasing, but it's pretty much the same thing. So right now, if you've got any more questions, pound them out into that WebEx chat or the Facebook chat, and because we're still collecting them right now offline here, and and if you don't get anything discussed, then you can also call the office and talk with them there. All right, next slide. Look, these office hours are now stale. Because, oh, pardon me, March 11th, we got some more office hours tomorrow evening. I'm sorry, there is one more time there. Okay, but there's an email address on the website as well, the clerks at guelph.ca. You can send your questions.
John, could I jump in? Can we just speak very quickly about what we'll be doing after we get this feedback? There is another form of consultation that will occur a little later on, and that's partly to do with how we take this large mass of options and bring it down to something more manageable. Can you speak to that at all, or do you want me to?
A little bit. If you mean, I'm going to convene a little focus group
No, you can too, but the main thing is the next phase or the next round of consultation in this phase.
You've got me. We're going to come back with the preliminary options. I think we've kind of been over that, but we're going to come back after these preliminary options. We're going to whittle it down to some preferred options, and there'll be another round of consultation in April where we come back to the public and say, here's the short list, you know, or maybe, I mean, we can cross our fingers, maybe everybody has one favorite that we can put forward, but more likely a short list.
Well, I would say, John, that's what I was getting at, that we're not going to simply take all of these 13 and walk into council with one of them. I don't think that's the way we're going to go, but certainly this phase will help us decide, is there any appetite for 8 wards or 10 wards or 4 wards? And if there isn't, then we can concentrate on those that seem to have the most level of support within the community. And that will help us narrow it down, as you said, to something more manageable. Can't say for sure, but we would then ask for another round of responses to help build a recommendation. Council will probably only get 2 choices. Speaking early on here, putting more than 2 sometimes gets tricky to get to an answer, but we would try to narrow it down so that the council decision is pretty clear cut. And we will ask for the community to help us with that exercise as well.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't.
That's okay.
Following you there. Okay. So we don't have a ton of questions that we've collected so far. But if you're ready, I'm going to just share some of these questions, mostly for Bob and Dave to respond to. But there might be something around the data modeling that Eric wants to chime in on, or something that is more about the city perspective that maybe Dylan needs to speak to. But for the most part, I'm going to be directing them at both Bob and Dave, and you can choose how you want to deal with it. We had a question. It says, Mr. Williams, you talked about being directed. Who directed you to conduct the review this way? This goes back to council in November, right?
Council did. This is a council project. We were engaged by the city. Council established the parameters for the review, the kinds of things we were to look at, and we offered them a report which addressed the key questions, and council basically said, thank you, keep going. And in doing that, please consider A, B, and C that we talked about earlier on. So that's the direction. This is not a direction from staff. This is from council. They wish to see this range of options and alternative models for electing members of council.
Okay, and here's another question. Is there any case law that speaks to the notion of the most democratic representation and what that might mean? And if so, what is it, and does it relate, and how does it relate to municipalities, given that municipalities are usually much smaller than either provincial or federal constituencies? Is there any case law that speaks to democratic representation?
Well, the starting point, and David referred to this earlier, is this reference around electoral boundaries, which ironically was in Saskatchewan. It was about provincial boundaries. But the Supreme Court was asked to rule on the appropriateness of a form of representation or an allocation of seats. And that is what's referred to as the Carter decision. And that, while it's explicitly not about a municipality, it talks about how do we understand representation through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. How do we interpret that right on the basis of the electoral system put in place? And it's been the common practice in Ontario Municipal Board reviews of cases over the last couple of decades that inevitably the Carter decision will be used as a touch point for determining the appropriateness of a particular arrangement in a municipality. I'm not sure if that's the full question. Dave, did I miss out anything on there?
Case law that speaks to democratic representation?
It's Carter.
I've only heard of the Carter decision.
And there was a previous case in British Columbia, the Dixon case, but that was in a sense superseded by Carter. That was only a case heard in the British Columbia courts. Ironically, by the same justice, Beverly McLaughlin, wrote the Dixon decision. She also wrote the Carter decision. Okay. But that one is not really relevant to the same extent as Carter.
Okay. And it's another question. Why 13 alternatives? Actually, there's 4 models with 3 alternatives in each. Why has this been deliberately confusing?
Did Dave want to unmute and talk about that?
Yeah, sure, Dave, your turn. Why 13? Why make it so confusing?
Well, just to show that we didn't have any superstition, that's why we chose 13. No, as Robert mentioned, council told us to provide options that would be workable for 8 councillors, 10 councillors, or 12 councillors. So in order to comply with what council requested us to do, that's why we felt we began with the idea that we want 4, 5, 6 on up to 12. And we actually maybe we toyed with the idea a little bit of just presenting one possibility for some of those anyway, and we thought that would not be fair to people who are interested in seeing how the decision was made. So we ended up with two specific options for most of them. The sixth ward, because that was the status quo, we just felt that we had three options there, and we couldn't decide on our own. So that's why we've thrown those three options out to people. So I know it's a lot to digest. Most people will probably have a pretty strong feeling about they don't want certain things. You're probably, the average person is probably not actually starting with 13, because the average person probably has some view around, I'm not going to consider, a small number. I'm not going to consider a large number or something like that. But anyway, that's how we ended up with 13.
If I may, John, sorry, I was just going to add too, to remind people that, so there is a lot of options this time, 13 maps, it's a lot to go through, but remember that in April, that's going to be pared down. So there's going to be another round of engagement in April where you're going to see a significantly reduced number of options, and you're going to have a chance to look through that and review it again. So it is a lot. It's a first look at a large number of preliminary options before a later look at some more final options. That'll be a little bit easier to work through. The volume will be a little bit less when we come back for that second round.
Yeah, let me mention one other thing. Thanks, Dylan. We've gone through these fairly quickly tonight, and we had to with 13. But you can sit down with that report that is available on the website. You can sit down at your leisure and look at that report. So you'll have more time available to go through these than the few seconds that we had to spend on them tonight.
You're muted, John.
I know the slogan for 2020.
Yes,
muted.
yes, it's still muted. Yes.
I forget what I was going to say. I think. Sorry, the point too is that this is not our decision about what's right for Guelph. Council asked for certain kinds of scenarios, and our view, as David just suggested, is not to say, oh, there's only one way to do it. There's only one way to have 4 wards, or there's only one way to have 6 wards. There are a number of different ways of doing it, each one with different attributes, different parts of the package, if I can call it that. And I think we felt it was incumbent on us to let the community know there's more than one way to do this. And so that's why we want you to be able to say, yeah, that one works, but that one doesn't. And that will help us come down, because these are preliminary. These are not the things that will necessarily go to council, although as I think David suggested earlier, if it suddenly the survey tells us that there is one of these of the 13 that is overwhelmingly popular, I'll call it, with the community, then we will look at that carefully as one of the ones we would take forward. If there's no real consensus, then the scenarios may be a little bit different. But until we see what the community tells us, that's hard to be definitive about. But it's a helpful way for us to decide, yeah, this one worked. And I have to say, in passing, there were an awful lot of other ideas that we played around with that just didn't work for various reasons. And fortunately, we didn't give you 40 to choose from. It's only 13.
Yeah. I just want to follow up with that and ask simple question. Would it be normal in all of the ward boundary reviews that you've done in other cities and towns and such, would presenting the public with such a broad suite of options, is that normal or commonplace?
I would say no, but again, because we were asked to consider a number of scenarios, and overlaid with that question of one member versus 2, that this is why this has become in itself, on the face of it, a much more complex set of choices, because picking certain of the numbers may or may not mean a single member or a double or 2-member ward. So this is why it is more complicated. If it were strictly a ward boundary review and let's just say for sake of argument, that in that November meeting, council had definitively said, come back with a 6-ward, 2-member scenario, then it'd be a different exercise again.
Right.
Or if it had said, give us options to elect 8 members, again, it would be much simpler. This was, and I think fairly, because it is a discussion that council wanted to have about the right way to structure the government going forward, the council going forward. It asked us to do a lot of things, and that's what we've tried to bring back in this particular phase of the review.
Yeah. Okay. This is a little change of pace here. How does the proposed conservative provincial legislation for an expanded greenbelt affect the proposed development in Clare Maltby, which directly impacts population in the south if development gets curtailed as a result? So have factors like that been taken into consideration in making these projections? Or...
I will start, and I'm going to invite Eric Carvinen to join up in a minute. But the catch there would be that developed these models on the basis of what we knew when we started, or at a certain date. And Eric can speak to what are the figures we're using. Should in fact major changes come along, that may require us to rethink some of these, certainly some of the population figures. But until that is actually implemented, we're not really able to, we can't read the future on those kinds of things. The assumptions about population forecasts are based on the rules, if you will, related to intensification and various other things that were in place within the last month or so, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know, Eric, did you want to unmute yourself and see if you can speak to that at all? About what data was included or in your projections?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Eric Carvinen here from Watson and Associates, project manager for this review. No, it's an excellent question on growth. Our direction on growth was provided to us from city planning staff, and certainly Clare Maltby is a significant part of the city's growth picture over the next decade. The growth metrics were prepared back in January of this year, and based on the information we had at the time. And it was based on information from the city planning staff. And for Clare Maltby, our growth projections and assumptions were based on the Clare Maltby secondary plan preferred concept scenario. And that was the best information we had at the time to model the growth projections that have been included in this review.
Okay. Along very similar lines, hang on, Eric. I think you may have answered the next question. The next question was sort of the same question, but it had to do with a different zone. And it was I'm going to say this, the Dolime Quarry area. Was that kind of projection out into the future drawn into these population projections?
Sorry, what was the name of the quarry?
Dolime or Dulime.
I can take that one. Sorry,
Okay.
Eric. I can answer that question, John. The simple or the short answer is no. So the Dolime quarry lands haven't been included in this review, and there's a couple of reasons for it. We're early in that process, so the city would need to annex those lands. There would need to be provincial and city planning approvals before the redevelopment could happen. And then subsequently, as you can imagine, redeveloping a quarry into residential land is going to take some time. So because those approvals aren't in place, that's not a certainty. That hasn't been included in this review. The other important thing to remember is that we're looking at a 10-year time horizon right now, at which point, presumably, we would want to go through a similar exercise. And when you look at the Dolime lands and sort of project out, when would we actually have people living there? When would it actually start to impact the populations of our wards? You're looking toward the end of this 10-year cycle, at which point we would be looking at ward boundaries again, potentially. And then, of course, if there was changes in city boundaries, changes in residential development, those would be factored in at that point.
Thank you. All right. Slight change of pace here.
Right.
I don't, oh, let me just get to the question. Why, question of why, I don't disagree with the sentiment, yet the question of why Guelph should have full-time councillor members when no other municipality except Toronto has such. Can one of you speak to why we were even asking people about having full-time or part-time councillors? It's one of the questions on the survey, and it's
Right.
something in the council composition phase as well. Why is
David,
that
can
being
you take
asked?
that?
Actually, I don't see David.
Well, it was something that we were asked to have a look at. I mean, that was part of our terms of reference when Watson started the project. Toronto does have full-time councillors. There are other municipalities, Hamilton and Ottawa, or other single-tier municipalities that have full-time councillors. And in a number of regions, councillors are full-time because they're paid by both the lower tier municipality and the region. So they end up being full-time councillors, but they sort of have two jobs, if you will. What we heard is from councillors in the city of Guelph is that their job is expanding. It's becoming more complicated, more time consuming. And so that's why it was on the agenda. And again, it's like what we are looking at in terms of the plan, in terms of the ward boundaries. It's an option, and we're inviting people to comment on it.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here that maybe I should answer. It says, I thought you were already collecting input via the survey. Don't we already have some input from the community regarding the 13 models? The answer is, we're still waiting for more people to answer, and the consultation period is open until the 14th, open until Sunday. So the more comments, the merrier. So it is still open. It is not closed. Another process or question, are the original survey results public from the January? It says the 220 responses public, and if so, can we see them? We included the survey responses from the council composition in the final report that went to council in November, and I would fully anticipate that all of this is going to be available in the final report so that people can go through it and see, yes, it was captured. That's the intention, is to make sure that it's all quite available. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to weigh in on that. Maybe Dylan, or we do make that available.
Yeah, I think the simple answer is all of the feedback that we're collecting is available. So everything that was collected as part of the first phase was included in the reports that went to council, and everything that's been collected in this phase so far is in the reporting to date, and it'll all be included when we report to council, rather when Watson and Associates reports to council in June of this year.
Something that's kind of cool is that the city uses an engagement platform, and that platform actually generates its own insight about levels of engagement. There's another one. It's a long question. I'm having trouble to sort through to find the gist of the question, maybe because it's a bit rhetorical. It says, given that in phase one, you conducted a survey with over 600 participants, and the clear majority said they wanted 12 plus counselors and 2 or more counselors per ward, you followed the phase one report recommending 8 single member wards, and received significant criticism from the public for making that recommendation. I remember that council meeting, yes. That ignores and minimizes the public input. You're sent back to the drawing board for council. Why does the latest report include 9 out of 13 possible arrangements which fail to satisfy the 12 plus total and 2 per ward criteria identified in the public consultations? Why bother seeking input if you're going to ignore it?
I'll go back to that direction. Council did not ask us to develop models to elect more than 12 councillors. That was council's decision, not our decision. We made a recommendation based on what we believed was a direction that should be pursued. but that is not a final decision either. That is a recommendation based on a variety of sources, including the public feedback, but a number of sources, and that was the recommendation to council. Council did not say create a system to elect some other number above 12. So this is not a matter of us ignoring that proposal at this phase. That was not part of what council wanted.
Yeah. And anybody else? Because certainly in my understanding of the project, we're supposed to have a combination of public input and best practices and research and projections, and it all has to be considered. And it's not just a simple up and down vote, but we're looking for the why underneath the answers at all times. And even in this round of survey, we say, what's your favorite, but why? We want to know the why people are interested in particular models. And that's what can really influence thinking as far as I can observe here. So I think I've come through all the questions. The rest of the rest is comments and opinions that are being posted. So let's see now, we've got 4 minutes. So what I'd like to suggest now is that if there's any additional questions from anybody who has not had a chance to get their question asked or answered, now would be a good time to do it. There's a little hands up sign in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that if you just put up your hand in WebEx, we'll be able to see you. And we could, then you could just unmute yourself and we can try to squeeze in 1 or 2 more questions if you've got them. Anybody else got a different kind of question?
I don't see any hands going up, John, but I know we do have Mr. Alan Hall on the line who indicated earlier that he was hoping to ask a question. So maybe we can unmute Alan and see if he does. The
Yes,
hand raise icon can be tough to find a little bit, but it is down there in the bottom right, a little black and white hand if you're in the WebEx event.
It looks like there's a little telephone symbol beside him, so he's not using a computer, he's using a phone. So thank you for that observation there.
So you are unmuted.
Hello.
Perfect.
Go ahead, Alan.
Hello. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I always find this topic very interesting, as Professor Williams could tell you. Now, I did make a submission to, I sent it to the city clerk and the councillors for an additional 6-word proposal, because it looked to my mind that 2 of the 6-word proposals really were fairly similar, and I thought that having a 6-word proposal that included the university with the downtown area would have some interest. Is that I know you'd mentioned that you had considered many other options, and these were the 13 diamonds out of the gravel, I guess. Did you consider an option that would actually put the downtown area in with the university?
That's a good single question. Who wants to take that?
I have to say at the moment, I can't recall, Alan, whether there was a scenario of that sort in the mix. There were a variety of approaches to the areas north of the river and south. And we have seen your submission, and you very clearly say that in a sense the river doesn't matter as a boundary. You'd prefer to see words that cross over. We have not got very many of those in this mix, but the idea of the university and downtown, I'm pretty sure David and maybe Eric can help me too. I don't recall that we had one that was explicitly built around that kind of combination as the basis for award. But you've made the submission. We'll certainly have a look at it as we collect all of the other evidence from this round of consultation and see where it leads us.
Okay.
Very good.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. I'm just going to go by the little icons beside people's names. I noticed somebody by the name of Joni has joined from a mobile device, so maybe doesn't have the same kind of access to raising hands and stuff like that. I'm going to have somebody unmute you, Joni, and see if you had some questions to ask as well. No, not hearing anything. And then I'm going to do the same thing for someone who's joined. It seems to have joined on the on a mobile device. Someone by the name of Morgan. Oh, Morgan, you're also on Facebook. So we've got lots of questions from Morgan already. So she's been prolific this evening on Facebook. So this is great, great input already. In that case, we're at 8:31. Is there anything further to add? Any further answers that have come to mind, sort of afterthoughts after answering a question the first time around? Or are we done?
If Bob and Dave don't have anything else to add, I just remind people that for this round of engagement, all the information you need is online, haveyoursay.guelph.ca. The surveys, the maps and everything are open until this Sunday. So end of day midnight on Sunday, March 14th for this round of engagement. And then of course, keep your eyes open because we know in early April, we're going to be back with the next and the final round of engagement for this project, but we've still got 4 or 5 days for this round for folks to get in, ask questions and leave us your comments.
Cool, thank you. All right, well, thank you very much, folks. I hope this has been educational and informative and it helps you to participate. And go for it. Let your friends and neighbors know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.